On a blazing Texas highway, two German shepherd puppies lay tangled in rusted barbed wire, bleeding, whimpering, and watching every car pass them by. No one stopped, until one man did. But why were they left to die in the first place? This story will touch your heart in ways you never imagined. As you listen, we'd love to know, where in the world are you watching from today? Make sure to subscribe for more stories that speak to the heart. Now, let's begin. The late summer sun hung heavy over San Marcos, Texas, pouring molten heat onto the highway until the asphalt shimmered like a mirage. The air was dry enough to crack lips, and the smell of hot tar and dust clung to everything. Ethan Ward gripped the steering wheel of his old navy blue pickup truck, the fabric of his faded t-shirt clinging to his back with sweat. At 37, Ethan bore the kind of presence that drew quiet attention, not because of any loud gesture, but because he carried himself like someone who had seen too much. His frame was broad from years in the infantry, shoulders squared even when he tried to relax, and his face, sun-worn and angular, was framed by a rough stubble that he never seemed to bother shaving. His hair, once dark, was now dusted with the early signs of gray, cut short in the same no-nonsense style he'd kept in the army. The deep lines at the corners of his brown eyes spoke of sleepless nights and memories he never invited, but couldn't keep away. Life after 8 years of deployment had been nothing like he'd imagined. Returning to San Marcos, the town where he'd grown up, hadn't been a homecoming. It felt more like an exile. The familiar streets only made the absences louder. Friends had moved on, family was gone, and the silence in his small house on the edge of town was the kind that echoed in his chest. On days like this, Ethan drove without a destination, letting the miles slip by in the hope that motion might keep the shadows in his mind from catching up. The highway was empty but for the occasional 18-wheeler thundering past in the opposite direction. Heat waves distorted the view ahead, making the road seem to ripple like water. It was in that shifting haze that Ethan caught something, a flicker of movement at the very edge of the shoulder, near a patch of sun-bleached grass. At first, he thought it was trash, a black shape tangled in weeds, but as his truck drew closer, he saw the movement again, slight and pitiful, his brow furrowed. He slowed, eyes narrowing against the glare. That's when he saw them. Two tiny German shepherd puppies lay half-hidden in the grass, their bodies twisted unnaturally. Rusted barbed wire was wrapped around them like a cruel snare, cutting into their fur and skin. The metal glinted under the sun, biting deep into tender flesh. Dried blood clung in dark streaks along their legs, and their breathing was shallow, rapid. One pup, with a coat of deep black and tan, lifted its head just enough to let out a hoarse, broken whimper. The other, smaller, with lighter golden-brown fur and darker ears, lay completely still except for the faint rise and fall of its chest. Ethan's hands tightened on the wheel. For a split second, his instinct was to drive on. He knew that getting involved could mean trouble, but that thought died quickly. He knew too well what it meant to be abandoned in the heat with no way out. The image of them in his rearview mirror was something he wouldn't be able to live with. He pulled onto the shoulder, gravel crunching under his tires, and cut the engine. The sudden quiet was suffocating, broken only by the hiss of cicadas in the grass. He stepped out, boots hitting the ground with purpose, and moved toward the pups. The closer he got, the more his chest tightened. Their eyes followed him, one pair wide with fear, the other half-lidded, dulled by exhaustion. "Easy," he murmured, his voice low and steady, the way he might speak to a frightened soldier in the field. "I'm not here to hurt you." Kneeling down, he reached into his back pocket and pulled out the small folding knife he always carried. He slid one knee into the dirt and studied the tangle of barbed wire. Whoever had done this hadn't been careless. They had wrapped it multiple times, twisting it to dig in deeper. The thought made his jaw clench. He worked slowly, careful not to startle them, cutting strand by strand. Each snip revealed raw skin beneath, angry and red. The darker pup flinched once, but didn't try to pull away, as if sensing that escape was finally possible. The smaller one gave no reaction at all. Its stillness was almost worse. When the last strand fell away, Ethan gently gathered them into his arms. They were lighter than they should have been, all bones and trembling muscles under thin fur. He could feel their rapid heartbeats against his chest. He adjusted his hold so the barbed wire stayed far from them, then stood. His truck wasn't far, but each step felt heavier than the last. The heat pressed in, and the smell of blood and rust clung stubbornly. He opened the passenger door, placing them carefully on an old army blanket he kept on the seat. The black and tan pup immediately curled protectively around the smaller one. Ethan reached into the back of the truck, pulled out his canteen, and poured a small amount of water into his palm. He held it close to the pups' mouths. The darker one lapped weakly, while the lighter one took several seconds before flicking its tongue against the water, almost surprised by the taste. "You're tougher than you look," he said quietly, not sure if he was talking to them or himself. Sliding back into the driver's seat, he started the engine. As he pulled back onto the highway, he kept glancing over at them. Every so often, the darker pup's eyes met his. Sharp, watchful. Even through the haze of exhaustion, Ethan felt something stir in his chest, a faint echo of purpose he hadn't felt since before the war. The drive home was short, but each red light and slow-moving vehicle felt like an unnecessary test of patience. When he finally turned into the gravel driveway of his small, weather-worn house, he cut the engine and stepped out quickly, moving to the passenger side. The sun had shifted, casting long shadows across the yard. Inside, his home was sparsely furnished, just the basics, with a few worn photographs on the wall. He cleared a corner near the couch, spreading out a second blanket, and placed the pups down gently. The smaller one whimpered softly, curling in on itself. The black and tan stayed close, pressing its side against its sibling, as if to shield it. Ethan crouched beside them, his elbows resting on his knees. He wasn't a man who took in strays. He'd never even owned a pet. The army had taught him to keep attachments light, to avoid holding on to what could be taken away. But looking at these two, he knew he couldn't just patch them up and send them off. For now, all that mattered was that they were here, alive, and no longer tangled in that cruel wire. Tomorrow, he'd figure out the rest. The sun had slipped low over San Marcos by the time Ethan closed the front door, shutting out the fading orange light and the hum of the highway. The air inside was cooler but heavy with the scent of dust and the faint coppery tang of blood. Shadow and Blaze lay curled on the blanket in the corner, their small bodies pressed close, eyes following his every movement with a mix of wariness and exhaustion. Ethan crouched beside them, his knees creaking, and reached for the battered metal first aid kit he kept under the couch. It wasn't much. Gauze rolls, antiseptic, a pair of scissors. But it would have to do for now. He'd cleaned worse wounds under worse conditions, yet somehow these small injuries, carved into such fragile skin, felt more personal. "All right, let's see what we've got," he murmured, opening the kit. Shadow, the black and tan pup, lifted its head slightly, eyes alert and unblinking. Blaze, the smaller golden brown one, flinched as soon as Ethan's hand brushed close. Their reactions told him something important. These weren't the skittish moves of strays. They were the reactions of animals that had learned hands could hurt. Ethan worked slowly, dipping gauze into a shallow bowl of warm water he had brought from the kitchen. He cleaned around the wounds first, murmuring low reassurances as he snipped away bits of fur matted with dried blood. Shadow tolerated the process with tense stillness, muscles tight beneath the thin skin. Blaze trembled so hard Ethan could feel it through the gauze, each touch making the little pup's ribs expand in quick, shallow breaths. When he reached for the antiseptic, he hesitated. "This is gonna sting," he said softly, more to prepare himself than them. He dabbed the liquid gently, watching their reactions. Shadow flinched once, but stayed still, gaze fixed on him, as if memorizing his face. Blaze let out a small whimper, and Ethan's chest tightened. He set the bottle aside quickly and wrapped both sets of wounds with strips of gauze, careful not to pull too tight. Once the bandages were secure, he fetched a shallow dish and filled it with cool water. Shadow moved first, lowering its head to lap greedily, while Blaze waited until Ethan stepped back before taking cautious sips. The sight made him think of patrols in the desert, how even the smallest comfort felt like a lifeline after days of nothing. From the kitchen, he opened a can of wet dog food and spooned it into 2 small bowls. The rich smell filled the air, and Shadow's ears perked immediately. Blaze hesitated again, eyes flicking from the food to Ethan's hands, as if expecting a trick. He stepped back and sat cross-legged on the floor, letting them approach on their own. Shadow dug in, tail giving a tentative twitch. Blaze inched forward, sniffed, and finally began to eat, each bite tentative but growing faster. It was then Ethan decided they needed names. "You," he said, nodding toward the darker pup. "Shadow." You've got that look. Watchful, quiet. Shadow paused mid-bite, ears twitching. Ethan turned to the smaller one. And you, Blaze. Small, but there's a spark in you, even if you don't know it yet. Naming them felt like crossing a line, one he hadn't realized he'd been avoiding. Names meant connection. Connection meant responsibility. And responsibility? Well, he'd learned the hard way that you could lose what you cared for in an instant. He shook the thought away and leaned back against the couch. Outside, the cicadas had quieted, replaced by the occasional hum of a passing car. He glanced toward the window, half expecting to see headlights slowing near the house. That feeling of being watched had crept up on him lately, unshakable. The pups finished eating and settled back on the blanket. Shadow curled protectively around Blaze, head resting over the smaller pup's neck. Ethan found himself watching them longer than he intended, noting the way Shadow's gaze never quite closed, always half alert. It was the same way soldiers slept in hostile territory. A knock on the door broke his focus. He stood, muscles stiff from sitting on the floor, and opened it to find his neighbor, Mrs. Arlene Cooper, standing on the porch. Arlene was in her late 60s, short and sturdy, with a halo of white curls and a face that had seen its share of sun and wind. She wore a floral blouse and held a small grocery bag in one hand. "Evening, Ethan," she said, voice warm but curious. "I saw your truck out front and thought I'd bring you some cornbread. Made too much." Ethan accepted the bag with a nod. "Thanks, Arlene. Appreciate it." She peered past him toward the living room. "I heard barking earlier. You got dogs now?" "Just helping a couple out," Ethan replied, keeping his voice even. Her brow furrowed. "Helping? From the look of them, sounds like someone's been hurting them." She lowered her voice. "You be careful. There's been talk about folks dumping animals lately. Some say it's more than just neglect." Ethan didn't press for details. Arlene was the type to share more when she wanted to. He thanked her again, closed the door, and set the cornbread on the counter. Her words lingered, though, threading into the unease already circling in his mind. Back in the living room, Blaze had shifted, resting her head on her paws. Ethan knelt beside her, running his fingers lightly along her back. She tensed at first, but didn't pull away. "We'll figure this out," he murmured. Before turning in for the night, he carried both pups into his bedroom, setting their blanket beside the bed. The house felt less empty with their quiet breathing filling the space. Still, as he lay down, the thought pressed in. Those wounds weren't from an accident. Someone had meant to cause pain. And that someone was still out there. The morning air in San Marcos was cooler than usual, a thin veil of fog clinging low over the streets as Ethan loaded Shadow and Blaze into the cab of his truck. Both pups had eaten well for the first time since he had found them, their eyes a little brighter, but their bodies still frail under their fur. The bandages on their legs needed a professional's touch, and Ethan knew he couldn't put it off any longer. He drove toward the small veterinary clinic on the south side of town, a modest brick building with a faded green awning. The sign out front read, "Harper Veterinary Care," the paint peeling but the letters still legible. Inside, the air smelled faintly of antiseptic and hay from the feed store next door. A woman in her mid-40s stood behind the reception counter, tall and willowy, with straight auburn hair pulled into a low ponytail. She wore thin-framed glasses perched on a freckled nose and had the calm, unhurried manner of someone used to both sick animals and worried owners. Her name tag read, Dr. Claire Harper. "You must be Ethan," she said with a polite nod, her green eyes flicking to the pups in his arms. "Let's get them into an exam room right away." Inside the small room, she set out a soft towel on the steel table and motioned for Ethan to place the dogs down. Shadow sat upright almost immediately, head turning to track every movement, while Blaze sank low against the towel, ears pressed back. Dr. Harper moved with deliberate gentleness, speaking softly as she examined their injuries. "These wounds," she said after a moment, her brow furrowing, "they're consistent with deliberate restraint. This wasn't an accident." Ethan didn't respond at first. He had suspected it, but hearing it confirmed hardened the knot in his stomach. She reached for a small handheld scanner from the counter. "Let's see if they have microchips. If we can find an owner, maybe we can get answers." The scanner beeped over Shadow first, and a line of numbers appeared on the small screen. She repeated the process with Blaze. Another beep, another number. Dr. Harper typed them into her computer, the silence in the room stretching until the printer on the desk whirred to life. Her expression changed, subtle, but enough for Ethan to notice. These chips are registered to the same owner, a man named Carl Mendez. She glanced at Ethan over the rim of her glasses. Does that name mean anything to you? Ethan shook his head, but the name settled into his mind like a weight. He's known in certain circles, Dr. Harper continued carefully. Deals in working-line German shepherds, mostly for law enforcement contracts. There have been rumors, unverified but troubling, about how he handles puppies that don't meet his standards. Ethan's voice was low. And by handle, you mean neglect, euthanasia, sometimes worse, she said, her tone flat, as if saying it without emotion might make it easier. A sharp rap at the door interrupted them. A younger man stepped in, Jake Morales, the clinic's veterinary assistant, barely in his 20s. He was wiry, with messy dark hair under a backward cap and a perpetual smudge of grease on his cheek from tinkering with his motorcycle between shifts. "Doc, the feed order's here," Jake said, then paused when he saw the pups. His brown eyes softened. "Poor things. What happened to them?" "Barbed wire," Ethan replied. Jake's jaw tightened. "I've heard of Mendez. My uncle breeds cattle dogs. Said that guy's been run out of 2 counties already. If he's dumping pups here..." He let the sentence trail off, but the meaning was clear. Dr. Harper finished bandaging the wounds with fresh gauze and gave Ethan a list of antibiotics and feeding instructions. "They'll recover, but it will take time. And Ethan..." She hesitated, meeting his eyes. "Be careful. If these dogs came from Mendez, he may want them back, for the wrong reasons." Back in the truck, Shadow stood with front paws braced against the door, nose pressed to the glass, ears alert. Blaze lay curled on the seat beside Ethan, head resting lightly against his arm. Ethan drove aimlessly for a while, the name Carl Mendez echoing in his head. He thought about the deliberate cruelty of the barbed wire, the way the pups had been left in plain sight, yet hidden enough for no one to notice. Whoever had done it hadn't been sloppy. They'd been making a point. He pulled into the parking lot of a small diner he knew, Patty's Roadside Grill, the kind of place where the coffee was strong and the gossip stronger. Inside, the smell of frying bacon wrapped around him like a familiar coat. Behind the counter, Patty herself was pouring coffee for a trucker. She was in her early 50s, round-faced with dyed black hair piled high, wearing a floral apron over her jeans. Patty had known Ethan since he was a teenager, back when his biggest trouble was skipping class to fish down at the river. "Well, if it isn't Ward," she said with a grin. "Haven't seen you in here for weeks." "Busy," Ethan replied, sliding onto a stool. Patty's eyes dropped to the pups at his feet, now curled together in a blanket. "Those yours?" "Found them on the highway. Someone's idea of a joke," he said bitterly. Patty's smile faded. "You know there's been talk about a man sniffing around town, looking to buy or dispose of dogs. Tall, late 50s, graying beard. Name's Mendez, I think." Ethan's fingers tightened on his coffee cup. "You're sure?" "As sure as anyone can be without shaking his hand. Heard he was meeting someone out by the old livestock auction yard last week." Ethan nodded slowly. The pieces were falling into place, not enough to act on, but enough to know this wasn't over. He finished his coffee, thanked Patty, and stepped back into the sunlight. The fog had burned off, leaving the sky sharp and blue. In the truck, Shadow climbed into his lap uninvited, staring at him with those steady, intelligent eyes. Blaze shifted closer, her tail giving a faint twitch. Ethan rested a hand on each of them. "We'll get to the bottom of this," he said quietly. The road ahead was uncertain, but the name Carl Mendez was no longer just a rumor. It was a trail, and Ethan intended to follow it. For 3 days after his visit to Patty's diner, Ethan kept to his usual routine, or at least he tried to make it look that way. The truth was, his senses had been tuned sharp, the way they were on patrol overseas when danger was close but unseen. Every time he stepped outside to let Shadow and Blaze into the yard, he scanned the street. It was subtle at first, a flicker of movement in the corner of his vision, a set of headlights lingering a little too long at the stop sign. But soon there was no mistaking it. A black SUV kept passing his street at odd hours, always slow enough for whoever was inside to look. On the 4th evening, just before sunset, he was in the yard tossing a worn tennis ball for Shadow when he saw it again. The SUV rolled past, windows tinted too dark to see through, then disappeared around the bend. Blaze, smaller and still hesitant with new surroundings, stayed near the porch, ears flicking at every sound. Ethan stood still, the ball forgotten in his hand, until the rumble of the engine faded completely. That night, the feeling of being watched grew heavier. He kept the living room light off and sat near the front window, his frame hidden in shadow. Shadow lay at his feet, head up, ears twitching with every creak of the house. Blaze dozed lightly beside the couch, tail tucked close. Around midnight, the faint crunch of gravel outside made Ethan's muscles tighten. Shadow's head snapped toward the sound, a low growl starting in his chest. Ethan rose silently, moving toward the back door, and caught sight of movement by the shed. A man, crouched low, was working at the latch with one hand while holding a small flashlight in the other. The beam swept briefly across his own face, thin, sharp-boned, with deep lines etched by sun and bad living. His hair was short and uneven, his jaw covered in patchy stubble. The clothes he wore, dark jeans, faded work shirt, were nondescript, but his posture screamed purpose. Shadow barked once, sharp and loud. The man's head jerked up, the flashlight beam wobbling wildly before it went dark. Ethan stepped out onto the porch, his silhouette blocking the doorway. "You picked the wrong yard," he said, his voice low and steady. The intruder froze for half a heartbeat before bolting toward the street. Shadow lunged forward, barking furiously, the sound echoing through the quiet neighborhood. Blaze joined in, her smaller bark sharp with alarm. Ethan didn't chase. He knew better than to leave his ground. The man dove into the passenger side of a vehicle parked under the trees, a black SUV, and it roared away, gravel spitting from the tires. Ethan's phone was in his hand before the sound of the engine faded. He called the San Marcos Police Department and gave a clear, clipped account. 20 minutes later, a patrol car rolled up, the headlights sweeping across the yard. Officer Luke Ramirez stepped out, adjusting his duty belt. He was in his mid-30s, broad-shouldered, with close-cropped dark hair and a neatly trimmed goatee. His expression was professional, but carried the weight of someone who'd seen more than his share of calls that went nowhere. "Evening, Ethan," Ramirez said, glancing toward the dogs. "Heard you had some unwanted company." Ethan told him everything. What he'd seen, the SUV, the man at the shed. Ramirez took notes, but his tone stayed even, almost too calm. "We'll add it to the report. Best advice I can give you is to keep your doors locked and maybe add some motion lights out back. Sometimes just making it harder is enough to make them move on." Ethan's jaw tightened. "This isn't random, Luke. That's the same vehicle I've seen circling the block all week. Whoever they are, they're not just looking for trouble. They're looking for something specific." Ramirez met his eyes for a moment, then sighed. "I'll pass it up the chain. Just watch yourself. People like that don't usually knock twice." When the patrol car left, the yard fell into silence again. Ethan stood for a long moment, the dogs pressed close on either side. The calm felt false, like the air before a storm. The next day, Ethan drove into town and stopped at an outdoor supply store. The man behind the counter, Hank Dorsey, was in his late 50s, heavy-set with a thick salt and pepper beard and a baseball cap pulled low. Hank had run the place for decades, selling everything from fishing lures to high-powered flashlights. He was a talker by nature, but today his brow furrowed as soon as Ethan mentioned a black SUV. "Yeah, I've seen one hanging around near the old auction yard," Hank said, leaning on the counter. "Not many folks go there these days. You sure you want to tangle with whoever's inside?" Ethan picked up a set of heavy-duty locks and a motion-activated security light. "I don't have much choice." That evening, he installed the lights around the back of the house and reinforced the shed latch. Shadow followed him closely, tail high, occasionally sniffing the air, as if he, too, sensed something just beyond reach. Blaze stayed nearer the porch but never let her gaze wander far from Ethan. When night fell, he set the shotgun within easy reach and kept the dogs inside. The glow from the new lights outside was reassuring, but he knew it was only a deterrent, not a guarantee. He sat in the living room, shadow curled by the door, Blaze against his leg, and went over the names in his mind. Mendez, the rumors, the SUV. Every piece pointed to the same conclusion. Someone wanted these dogs back, and they were willing to cross lines to get them. If they came again, they wouldn't find him unprepared. The next morning broke clear and bright, but Ethan's mind was far from calm. He sat at the kitchen table, coffee cooling in his hand. the small scrap of paper with an address written in Dr. Harper's neat handwriting lying in front of him. It was tied to the registration records from Shadow and Blaze's microchips, an old storage warehouse listed under Carl Mendez's business name, now supposedly vacant. Ethan doubted that. By mid-morning, he loaded Shadow and Blaze into the truck. He wasn't bringing them to the site. He planned to leave them with someone he trusted for a few hours. That someone was Marla Jennings, a friend of his late mother's. Marla was in her early 60s, short and spry, with cropped silver hair and a habit of wearing brightly patterned scarves no matter the weather. She lived in a small bungalow 3 streets over and had an easy warmth about her, the kind that made even nervous dogs relax. When Ethan pulled up, Marla stepped out onto her porch, wiping her hands on a gardening apron. "Well, if it isn't the elusive Mr. Ward," she called with a smile, then noticed the pups. "Oh, they're beautiful. Poor baby's still healing, I see." "They're getting there," Ethan said, lifting Blaze gently into her arms while Shadow hovered close to his leg. "I need to check on something. Won't be more than a couple hours." Marla's eyes narrowed slightly at his tone, but she didn't press. "You go do what you need to do. They'll be safe here." With the dogs settled, Ethan drove out of town, the address leading him along narrow, cracked asphalt roads lined with mesquite trees. The warehouse came into view just after noon, a squat, corrugated metal building with faded paint and a chain-link fence sagging in places. Weeds grew high along the perimeter, and a battered sign hung crookedly from one post, the name of the previous business barely legible. He parked a good distance away, cutting the engine and walking the rest of the way in the heat. His boots crunched softly over the dirt shoulder. The gate stood slightly ajar, the lock hanging open. That alone told him no one expected casual visitors. Either they thought the place was forgotten, or they didn't care who stumbled in. Inside the fence, the smell hit him first, a sour, lingering stench of urine, old food, and neglect. The yard was littered with rusting barrels and broken pallets, but what caught his attention were the cages. Lining the shaded side of the warehouse were rows of metal kennels, their bars rusted and bent. Some still had chewed-up water bowls inside. Others were empty except for matted tufts of fur clinging to the corners. He moved slowly, pulling his phone from his pocket and snapping photos. Each step was deliberate, scanning for signs of recent use. In one cage, a chewed nylon collar lay in a heap, the name tag missing. In another, he found a cracked plastic tub with dry kibble crumbs stuck to the bottom. These weren't storage cages. They had been holding animals, and not long ago. A faint noise from inside the warehouse made him freeze. It wasn't loud, but it was enough. A dull thump, followed by what sounded like the scrape of metal. He edged along the wall toward a side door, finding it unlocked. The hinges groaned as he eased it open just enough to peer inside. The interior was dim, dust motes swirling in the narrow beams of light from grimy windows. Stacks of empty crates and feed bags leaned haphazardly against the walls. Toward the back, another row of cages sat, these slightly newer but still unclean. The floor was littered with shredded paper and the smell of mildew. No animals now, but their absence felt recent. Ethan lifted his phone again, recording a slow pan of the scene. As he moved closer, he noticed a clipboard hanging on a nail by the back wall. It was covered in handwritten notes, dates, litter numbers, cryptic notations like Batch 118 Pass and Batch 119 Cull. At the bottom of one page was a name, Mendez. A sudden sound outside made him snap the phone shut and slip toward the door. Through a crack, he saw a pickup truck pulling up the dirt road, dust billowing behind it. 2 men stepped out. One was tall and broad with a thick neck, wearing a grease-stained ball cap. The other was leaner, with a narrow face and deep-set eyes that darted over the property. Neither looked like they were here for anything good. Ethan slid out the side door and moved quickly along the fence line, keeping low. He didn't run until he was safely down the road and out of their line of sight. Back at his truck, he took one last glance in the rearview mirror. The men were unloading something from the pickup, large bags, maybe feed or maybe not. By the time he returned to Marla's, the sun was low and the shadows were long across her lawn. Shadow bounded toward him as soon as he stepped out of the truck, tail wagging, while Blaze hung back shyly but with ears forward. "How did it go?" Marla asked, leaning on her porch railing. Ethan hesitated, then gave a small shake of his head. "It's worse than I thought." That evening, in the quiet of his kitchen, Shadow and Blaze lay at his feet while he reviewed the photos and video. The evidence was damning. Cages, notes, signs of recent activity. And now there were faces. Whoever these men were, they were connected to Mendez. Shadow lifted his head at the sound of Ethan's voice as he said softly, "We're not just sitting on this. Not anymore." Blaze edged closer, her tail brushing against his boot. They didn't know the details, but somehow they seemed to understand that something was changing. And for Ethan, the path forward was clear. The night air was heavy with the scent of mesquite and dry earth, the kind that clung to skin and clothes long after sunset. Ethan had been sitting at his kitchen table, the glow from his laptop casting deep shadows on the walls, reviewing the photos and videos from the warehouse for the 10th time. Shadow lay at the doorway to the living room, head up, ears alert. Blaze was curled by Ethan's chair, eyes half closed, but ears flicking at every creak in the house. It was close to 10 p.m. when the low rumble of an engine cut through the quiet. Ethan's spine stiffened. Headlights swept briefly across the front yard before disappearing. Someone had killed the lights. He stood slowly, every instinct honed by years in the service, telling him to move quietly and deliberately. Shadow rose in silence, Blaze lifting her head to watch him. A knock came at the door, sharp, deliberate, the kind meant to announce authority, not request entry. Ethan stepped to the side window and peered out. Two figures stood on his porch. The first was a broad-shouldered man in his late 50s, with a square jaw dusted in gray stubble, deep lines carved into his face, and eyes that held no warmth. He wore a dark denim jacket over a faded shirt, the posture of someone used to getting what he wanted. Ethan recognized him instantly from the name in Dr. Harper's file, Carl Mendez. Beside him stood a younger man, maybe mid-30s, lean with a narrow face, a crooked nose that spoke of an old break, and dark hair slicked back. His black leather jacket creaked as he shifted, and in his right hand he held a small black nylon bag. His gaze darted around the yard and then back to Ethan's door, restless. "Ward!" Mendez's voice was deep, raspy from years of cigarettes. "We're here for what's ours. No point making this ugly. Just bring them out." Ethan opened the door only halfway, keeping the frame between him and the men. "You mean the dogs you left to die in barbed wire? They're not yours anymore." Mendez's eyes narrowed, the muscle in his jaw ticking. "They're property. My property. You think a bleeding heart like you can just walk away with working dogs worth thousands?" The younger man stepped forward, his tone sharper. "We can do this easy, or we can do it the way that ends bad for you." From behind Ethan, Shadow gave a low, warning growl, the kind that vibrated in the floorboards. Blaze stood just behind her brother, her smaller frame tense, hackles raised. "You don't scare me," Ethan said, voice low. "You should leave." Mendez took a slow step forward onto the threshold. That was enough for Shadow. She surged forward with a bark that cracked the night air, Blaze right beside her. The sudden movement made the younger man stumble back, nearly tripping on the step. Mendez flinched but didn't retreat. Ethan moved fast, slipping through the door and shoving Mendez back with the flat of his hand to the man's chest. Mendez's weight shifted, and before he could recover, Ethan had hooked his leg behind the older man's and sent him stumbling to the porch railing. Years of training took over. Ethan pinned him against the railing with an arm across his chest, his other hand ready to push him face first, if needed. The younger man swore and reached into his jacket, but Shadow barked again, lunging forward. Her teeth snapped shut inches from his hand, and he froze, eyes wide. Blaze circled to his flank, her smaller frame weaving in a tight arc, cutting off his escape toward the steps. "Think very carefully about your next move," Ethan said, his voice cold. From the pocket of his jeans, he pulled his phone and thumbed to contact without taking his eyes off Mendez. "Maria," he said when the line picked up, "it's Ethan Ward. You're going to want to get here now." Maria Torres had been a classmate of Ethan's back in high school. Now she was the sheriff of Hayes County. 10 minutes later, the flash of red and blue lights cut through the night. Maria stepped out of the cruiser, her tan sheriff's jacket draped over her tall, athletic frame. Her dark hair, streaked with early silver, was pulled back in a no-nonsense bun, and her sharp brown eyes took in the scene instantly. "Carl Mendez," she said flatly, striding up the porch steps. "Didn't expect to see you here. Guess I won't have to track you down after all." Mendez shifted, trying to mask the tension in his shoulders. I'm here to collect what's mine. No law against that. Maria's eyes flicked to Ethan, then to Shadow and Blaze, still holding their ground. There's a law against trespassing, intimidation, and attempted theft. And considering your history, I'm guessing that bag your buddy's holding isn't full of Christmas cookies. The younger man's scowl deepened, but he didn't move. Maria motioned to the deputy who had arrived in a second cruiser. Search him. Within minutes, both men were in cuffs. Maria stepped close to Ethan. You all right? Fine, Ethan said, though the adrenaline was still burning in his chest. But they weren't going to leave without a fight. Maria's gaze shifted to the dogs. Looks like you've got yourself a pair of guardians. Ethan allowed a faint smile. Yeah, they've earned it. As the cruisers pulled away, the quiet settled back over the house. Inside, Shadow and Blaze paced a moment before finally lying down near Ethan's chair, eyes still bright with the aftershock of the encounter. Ethan sat heavily, letting the weight of what had just happened sink in. The message was clear. Mendez wasn't done. But neither was he. 2 days after the confrontation, the air in San Marcos felt different. Not calmer, but charged, like the quiet before a summer storm. Ethan had spent those days replaying every moment, every look in Mendez's eyes, every word he and his accomplice had said. Shadow and Blaze were never far from him now, their presence like a constant reminder of what was at stake. Shadow's alert gaze tracked every sound outside, while Blaze had begun to find her courage, spending more time near the door, as if ready to stand guard again if needed. On the morning of the third day, Ethan's phone rang. The caller ID read, Sheriff Maria Torres. Her voice was brisk but warm. Ethan, I need you to come down to the station. Bring that evidence you've been holding on to. The Hays County Sheriff's Office sat in a low sandstone building on the edge of downtown. Inside, the air smelled faintly of coffee and old paper. Maria met him at the front desk, dressed in her tan uniform, with her badge gleaming under the fluorescent lights. She led him down a hallway to a small conference room. Inside were 2 other people. Detective Sam Villarreal, a stocky man in his late 40s with a thick mustache and weathered skin, wearing a gray dress shirt with the sleeves rolled up, and Assistant District Attorney Linda Park, a tall, sharp-featured woman in her late 30s with sleek black hair and a fitted navy suit. Maria introduced them quickly. Sam gave Ethan a firm handshake, his grip calloused, eyes steady but assessing. Linda offered a polite nod, her expression focused, as though already weighing every piece of this case in her mind. Ethan, Maria began, we've reviewed the photos and videos you took at the warehouse. They match some anonymous tips we've gotten over the past year about Mendez. We just never had enough to get a warrant. Until now. Sam leaned forward, tapping a thick folder. These records you found, with the call notes, they're gold. We can tie them to transport logs from a few months back. It paints a picture of an operation moving dogs across county lines without proper documentation. Linda added, that's interstate trafficking if they cross into Oklahoma or Louisiana. Add animal cruelty charges and unlicensed breeding, and he's looking at serious time. By late afternoon, a small convoy of marked and unmarked vehicles rolled out toward the warehouse. Ethan wasn't part of the raid, but Maria had agreed he could follow in his truck at a safe distance. Shadow and Blaze stayed home with Marla, who promised to keep them inside no matter what. From the hill overlooking the property, Ethan watched through binoculars as deputies fanned out. A team approached the front gate, while others moved to the rear. The door was forced open, and within minutes, deputies were leading out cages. Some with frightened dogs inside, others empty but still reeking of neglect. One deputy carried out a trembling Belgian Malinois, its ribs showing through patchy fur. Another led 2 underweight German shepherds on makeshift leashes. Even from a distance, Ethan could see the animals' confusion and fear, their ears low and tails tucked. Inside the warehouse, deputies photographed the cages, crates, and a desk stacked with files. Sam emerged holding a laptop and a battered ledger, grinning grimly. Got his contacts, Ethan heard him say into his radio. By the time the search wrapped, 3 more men had been taken into custody. Ethan recognized one from the day he'd visited the warehouse. Broad frame, ball cap now in the hands of a deputy. The others were strangers, but their scowls spoke volumes. Back at the station, Maria met Ethan in her office. We've got enough to hit them hard, she said, sitting heavily in her chair. Mendez will be facing multiple felony counts, his crew too, and the ADA's already prepping for indictment. Linda Park entered with a stack of papers. "I'll be handling the prosecution personally. This is the kind of case that needs to be made an example of." News traveled fast. Within a day, local TV stations aired footage of the raid. Photos of the rescued dogs circulated online, sparking outrage across Texas. Social media lit up with calls for stricter laws on animal welfare and for closing loopholes in breeding regulations. That evening, Ethan stood on his porch, phone buzzing with messages from people he barely knew, some offering thanks, others sharing their own rescue stories. Shadow sat beside him, ears perked, while Blaze lay at his feet, her head resting lightly on his boot. For the first time in weeks, Ethan felt something shift inside him. The fight wasn't over. There would be court dates, statements, and more battles ahead. But the network was exposed, and the man who had nearly taken these two from him was behind bars. The sky over San Marcos was streaked with the last light of day. Ethan glanced down at Shadow and Blaze. "We did all right," he murmured. Blaze's tail gave a small, contented thump, and Shadow leaned closer, eyes steady on the horizon. The weeks after the raid passed in a slow, steady rhythm, like the gentle turning of a season. San Marcos had returned to its quiet routines. But for Ethan, the world felt subtly different. The house no longer echoed with silence. Every morning began with the soft click of nails on hardwood as Shadow padded into the kitchen ahead of him, and Blaze's warm presence curled against his leg as he drank his first cup of coffee. Shadow's recovery had been remarkable. Her black and tan coat now gleamed in the sunlight, her once cautious movements replaced by confident strides. She held herself like a sentry, ears always tuned to the smallest sound. Blaze, smaller and lighter, had grown into her own quiet bravery. Her golden brown fur had thickened, her eyes brightened, and while she still preferred to stick close to Ethan, she no longer flinched at the approach of strangers. The paperwork to adopt them had been straightforward. Maria herself had signed off on it. "They're already home," she'd said, handing him the forms with a knowing smile. That moment had sealed it. They were his, and he was theirs. In early spring, Ethan received a call from Captain Dale Rourke, a broad-shouldered man in his mid-50s, with a tanned, weather-worn face and kind blue eyes. Rourke had served with Ethan years ago, and now ran a small nonprofit pairing rescue dogs with veterans. "Heard about what you did," Rourke said, his deep voice carrying both warmth and gravity. "I could use someone with your patience and those dogs' instincts. Interested in volunteering?" Ethan had hesitated only long enough to glance at Shadow and Blaze, both watching him as though they understood. "Yeah," he said, "we're in." The first few sessions at the rescue center were tentative. The building was an old red brick firehouse on the edge of town, its garage doors replaced with wide glass panes that flooded the training floor with light. Dogs of all shapes and sizes moved through the space, some bounding with joy, others moving cautiously, still learning to trust again. Shadow adapted instantly, her focus drawing the admiration of other trainers. She demonstrated search patterns with precision, responding to Ethan's voice like a seasoned partner. Blaze, gentler in nature, became a favorite among the children who visited the program. Her calm demeanor coaxed shy smiles and tentative pats from kids who had never touched a dog before. One afternoon, Ethan was paired with Sergeant Mike Alvarado, a wiry, sharp-eyed veteran in his early 40s who walked with a cane. Mike had lost part of his leg during a deployment overseas and carried himself with quiet resilience. He was assigned a young Labrador mix who was still learning basic commands. Ethan watched Blaze sidle up to the lab, nuzzling gently until the dog relaxed. Mike chuckled. "She's got a gift," he said, "maybe more than you realize." Ethan began splitting his time between working with Shadow on advanced obedience and letting Blaze spend her sessions with children and therapy candidates. By the end of the month, he'd fallen into a comfortable routine, mornings at home with the dogs, afternoons at the center, evenings walking the open fields outside of town. As the weeks warmed into summer, Ethan was invited to speak at a local community event about the rescue and rehabilitation of working dogs. Standing on the small stage in the town square, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the brick pavement, he told their story, not just about barbed wire and cruelty, but about resilience, second chances, and the bond that had formed between them. Shadow sat at his right side, Blaze at his left, both still and attentive. The crowd's applause wasn't loud, but it was sincere. The real reward came later, in quiet moments. Like the evening when a young boy from the program, 10 years old, thin, with a nervous habit of wringing his hands, ran up to him after class. "Mr. Ward," the boy said, his voice tentative, "Blaze, she makes me feel safe." Ethan knelt down, resting a hand on the boy's shoulder. "She's good at that," he said. "She'll always have your back." That night, as the sun dipped low over the Texas plains, Ethan drove out to a field just beyond the city limits. He let Shadow and Blaze run free, their figures cutting dark shapes against the golden grass. The air smelled faintly of wildflowers and warm earth, and the horizon burned with streaks of orange and pink. He stood there, hands in his pockets, watching them race each other, tongues lolling, tails high. There had been a time, not long ago, when he had thought his life had shrunk down to quiet meals and lonely nights. But now, with these two lives woven into his own, the world felt bigger again. As the sun slipped completely below the horizon, Shadow trotted back to him, Blaze right behind. They sat at his feet, their breaths quick from running, eyes shining in the fading light. Ethan crouched down, resting a hand on each head. "We made it," he murmured, "all of us." It was the first time in years he felt the weight in his chest ease, replaced by something warmer, something he recognized, finally, as peace. Sometimes, the smallest lives are saved by the smallest chances. A stranger driving down the right road at the right moment. A bark that breaks the silence. A decision to stop when the world keeps moving. I believe that's no accident. It's a reminder that God's hand works quietly in our everyday lives, guiding us toward moments where we can be His miracle for someone else, whether they walk on 2 legs or 4. In a world that often feels too busy, too loud, take a moment to look around you. Maybe there's someone, human or animal, waiting for a lifeline only you can give. And when you choose to act, you become part of something greater than yourself. If this story touched your heart, please share it so others can feel it too. Leave a comment with your thoughts and subscribe so you don't miss more stories that speak to the soul. May God bless you, your loved ones, and the animals that share your life. And may He guide your steps to be in the right place, at the right time, to bring hope where it's needed most.